Welcome, Jim and Al. We've been writing several pieces in Strategy Page about countries having problems building warships around the world, and it's not just one. It seems like there are several that are struggling, including the U.S. You want to sort of do a broad brush of it for us, Jim?
Yeah, the main problem is the United States no longer has a shipbuilding industry. It hasn't had for decades. And the only people really building ships are the handful of naval yards. As Al will be able to get into in detail, we basically turned stopped most of the Navy-owned yards and turned it over to free enterprise. But the problem was, and this is the key problem between not just America and China, but America, China, South Korea, and Japan. And one thing those three countries have in common is they're all major ship producers. Now, a problem we hear about with American shipbuilding is we can't find skilled people. Well, that's not a problem in China, Japan, and South Korea. In fact, until recently, South Korea, well, actually, within the last 10 years, South Korea, Japan, and China were trading places for first place. And I think they're still the top three. China is now in first place. But China has plenty of skilled labor. The other thing they don't have is, since World War II, we've built up this huge infrastructure of regulations and various political, obligations, which have interfered with the building of ships. We've come to accept the idea that a private contractor, so to speak, can bid low, get the contract. Of course, these days that's a given, and then basically get away with charging higher prices because of unforeseen circumstances. Sometimes they are unforeseen because Congress will interfere. The Navy has lost its ability to basically make up its mind, and that's how we got the Zumwalt and the LC, the littoral combat ship, the LCS. And we finally learned our lesson. We're building a new class of frigates, but instead of designing one from scratch, which we're woefully unable to do, we're basically going to apparently buy, what is it, Albert? The Italian one or the French one?
I think it's the Italian one.
Yeah, the Italians are doing very well, even though they still have a civilian shipbuilding industry, but they and France have maintained their shipbuilding chops, and they're in Germany too, and they're still getting a lot of export work. In fact, that's with South Korea and Japan. Japan finally changed their constitution or put a weasel clause in there somehow, but they are now exporting warships, and they do great work, and they turn the stuff out on time, especially South Korea. They're exporting like crazy, and China is as well. But the thing is, China can build a warship. Now, we don't know how good the Chinese warships are. That's something you got to take into account. During periods of extended peace, even the best shipbuilders make mistakes. The British saw that in the Falklands in 1982. Certain design decisions were made that were changed after that war. Same thing happened with the United States in the 1986 when we almost lost a destroyer that was patrolling the Persian Gulf, mainly to keep the Iranians from threatening shipping. But the Iraqis were out there too, going after the Iranians. And this Iraqi warplane came out there and fired an Exocet missile at the American destroyer, and the destroyer didn't have its automatic defense system. The phalanx turned on.
It was actually the Princeton, which was cruiser.
Oh, cruiser. Well, okay.
Yes.
Because these days the difference between a cruiser and a destroyer is a couple of thousand tons. Not like the old days when cruisers were cruisers and destroyers were tin cans. But anyway, that's a whole other subject. But the Chinese, for example, have so much excess capacity that they can afford, and this is what they do. They will go with basically subclass after subclass until they get it right. They did this with destroyers. Now, again, we don't know how right they are. They have not been in combat, but they are seriously training crews to the point where the Chinese military medicine community is complaining that, I think we discussed this once before, submarine sailors, 20% of them are having psychological problems. Of course, another problem the Chinese have is they have a huge labor shortage. And unlike their fishing boats, they can't hire foreigners at slave labor wages and conditions to make up most of the crew. They only want loyal Chinese. And there aren't enough loyal Chinese anymore. And they're all competing for basically more attractive civilian jobs or, Air Force or Army jobs. If you want to go in the Chinese military, you don't go in the Navy. I think the word's getting around. And that's made recruiting even more difficult. But when it comes to building ships that on paper appear and at sea appear to be the equivalent of our latest destroyers and other ships, it's obvious that they can match us in apparent quality. I suspect they're pretty close in actual quality, but again, we'll never know unless there's somehow the Chinese get involved in a shooting war. But whatever mistakes are made, they'll send everybody back to the yards to make adjustments or whatever. A lot of ships, older warships that they're replacing, one's based on Russian designs, they're having some of their weapons removed and turned into Coast Guard ships, which we're seeing pop up a lot in the South China Sea. Mm-hmm. But there's the problem. We don't have the skills anymore, literally, and our major opponent does. The Russians, by the way, who also don't have they used to have somewhat of a commercial shipbuilding industry delivering to a captive audience, namely their own economy and the Eastern European satellites, the ones they were occupied. But that's all gone, and their shipbuilding capacity has gone. They're worse than we are, although they weren't as good, as we are in our prime. But be that as it may, if you haven't got the labor base, the skills base, you're at a huge disadvantage. And if, like the United States, you've been subject to the victory disease for over half a century and all sorts of political interference, it's not surprising what's happened.
So, Al, what are some of the failures in the United States Navy?
You need a longer,
Well, in one sense, it's not just a failure of the Navy. The Army and the Air Force share the problem too. It's that we want a new ship, new tank, new plane to be able to do everything. Mm. Which is one reason why it takes us forever to get a new design. Because, you're trying to balance this mission requirement with that mission requirement. And, so you end up with something that doesn't work. Part of that is fear that Congress will cut the funding, I think. And so once, we were lucky with the Burkes. We got a really excellent design, which was actually evolutionary, not revolutionary. People, it was actually, the Burkes are actually sort of based on a previous destroyer design that was that came out in the 50s and the Spruances. But after that, we started, maybe we could do this, maybe we could do that. And the LCS is probably the best. First of all, it was originally supposed to be a green water and brown water, resource vessel, patrolling the shallow seas literally on the coasts, the littorals, and going up the rivers if necessary and into the bays and lagoons. And somehow it's too big for that job, and now we're trying to figure out what to do with them since we've invested pretty heavily in them. Before World War II, the Navy had, if you look at the 30s, when we started rebuilding the Navy after from World War I, we had a big holiday not building ships because we built so many. In World War I, we had like 300 destroyers or something, and hundreds of them in mothballs. So if you needed a new destroyer, you just hauled one out. But by the 1930s, of course, they were getting a little long in the tooth. If you look at the orders that are placed, you've got destroyers coming out in classes of 4. Hey, look, this looks like a good design. Let's build it. And so you could actually like order 12 destroyers in the 3 different classes. So that because you're not sure which one is better, and in fact, a couple of them did turn out to be poor. And the other thing the Navy did was, since the Navy had Navy yards that actually could build ships, was some of these ships were built in the Navy yards, and some of them were built in private yards. And the Navy yards, although they were lambasted by political interests as supposed, sinkholes of waste and all, usually came in lower cost than the private yards, because the private yards would add a little this and that. And the other thing that is almost never discussed is that if a ship is built in a Navy yard, then there's naval personnel there. If a ship is built in a private yard, you have to bring Navy personnel there to oversee construction. So you're not really saving any money, but you're shifting the cost from the from the shipyard budget to the Navy budget, so to speak. And so they came out with, or eventually the hugely successful World War II destroyers like the Fletchers and the Gearings and whatnot, which were produced, like almost like a mimeograph machine, just coming out like mad. Since we don't value certain missions, that's why we neglected the littorals for so long. I can't remember what the statistic, but I forget what % of the Navy's personnel in Vietnam were doing work in shallow water and up rivers and whatnot. And out of that group, only one guy made it to admiral. And this was a huge chunk of the Navy's work there. But the guys who were off the coast on the carriers and relatively safe, a lot of them made admiral. The aviators, of course, weren't, but the other countries that are building ships have some advantages. Let's face it, if you're Norway or Sweden, you're not building a ship that has to operate in environments from the Arctic to the tropics. But some of these designs are very good, and some countries like France particularly does have interests that are in one sense somewhat similar to ours in that they're all over the damn globe. They've been better able to design smaller ships for these missions. And that's one reason why we're going with the Italian frigate. And I think if you look at some of the other countries around, others are doing the same thing. The Turks have just ordered a flock of frigates. And I'm trying to remember if it's the Italian design or another one. So I guess, it's not just a Navy problem. It's a service-wide problem. It's just like now the armed forces are suddenly deciding, hey, after 20 years of the Army, after 20 years of doing low-intensity warfare, do we still know how to do high-intensity warfare? So, we haven't had a really good bunch of people in the presidency and in the cabinet overseeing defense. People who are not into the dollars and cents stuff, but are into this. How does this work? Which hampers us, I think. And you can see the British having a serious problem. They now have the second largest carrier fleet in the world. The Queen Elizabeth and the Prince of Wales are the biggest carriers in the world outside of the United States. And their budget is very constrained. So they basically have one task force. And yet they still have global interests. So this creates a problem for them. One way around it for them is there's a forgotten branch of the Navy that consumes a major chunk of the Navy's budget, and we never think about it, and that's the missile submarines. I forget what percent of the nation's nuclear capability is in the submarines, and we hardly ever hear about them.
Well, they're not only the silent service, they're the unseen service.
The unseen
they're underwater
service.
most of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they never do anything.
Yeah.
You know.
Now,
what they do is top secret. They're very good for intelligence gathering.
Yes.
and or the United States is still very good at building boats, right? Now, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong. China is still having problems building subs or nuclear subs that can stay underwater a long time, right? And Russia's having problems with their subs too, right?
Well, Russia has a problem, and the Chinese have a similar problem. Is they're trying to build, both countries are trying to build submarines with air-independent propulsion. This is a system. There are several of them out there, but basically they run on an electric motor that uses fuel that is basically created without producing a lot of fumes. It's a closed system, and it allows a diesel-electric sub to stay underwater for up to 2 weeks or more. The Russians kept having problems developing it. The Chinese got one working, but they found out it was more trouble, more money than it was worth, and they're backing off building a lot of their diesel-electric submarines to using AIP. Another advance, which the Japanese led the way in, was replacing the old lead batteries with lithium-ion batteries. Now, these were always considered dangerous because they tend to catch fire, which is unfortunate if you're in a submarine. But they developed technology which works. The South Koreans are copying it. The Chinese are trying to steal it, which they probably will eventually. And this, again, allows your typical diesel-electric submarine to stay underwater for up to a week. Now, I think what the Chinese have figured out, a diesel-electric submarine that can stay underwater for a week, operating at having a speed capability, but most of the time those boats are quieter than nukes because they haven't got a lot of cooling systems running to keep the nuclear reactor under control. They realized that a lithium-ion equipped, they're just the ones they have now, being able to stay underwater for 2 or 3 days or 4, depending on power usage, is effective enough. In other words, if they get the order, all right, we're going to war, go silent, or they get the signal, they can still operate at snorkel depth. That's just below the surface with a larger mast that basically brings in water, brings in air, and lets out the diesel exhaust. That's been around since World War II. But they get the message, again, via the mast, go silent, go here. Even though these messages are short and they're encrypted, they're vulnerable, obviously, to being cracked. Even the Chinese took heed of what happened to the Japanese and the Germans during World War II. And they've apparently gained it out and realized, well, this is all we really need. You can build 50% more submarines if you leave out the AIP. And once they get that lithium-ion battery technology, they'll have twice as much endurance underwater, which is, again, so as far as they're concerned, they're probably right. It's more than enough. In fact, we probably figured it out as well, because our submarine tactics with an old SSN nuclear-powered attack submarine force, we got about 50 or so of them. We have found out. Now, this is classified, so you didn't hear it from me. We have apparently gained it out as well, and of course, we often practice. Stalking Russian or Chinese or anybody's submarines, North Korean or Iranian, and never mention anything about it because it's a secret. I mean, if they knew that you're successfully stalking them and not being detected 90% of the time, you're in big trouble. Well, they're in big trouble. I think they figured out that they can't assume that when they're out there up to some nasty business, they haven't got an SSN on their tail. But the Navy realizes, in most cases, these stalking missions don't take that long. You're not going to stalk a guy for weeks at a time. You pick them up by long distance, a passive sonar. You close in at a higher speed when you get within range of being detected by their sonars. Because even when a nuclear sub is moving at a fairly high speed, it's not making a lot of noise. And again, the Navy has honed these tactics over decades, so we're very good at it. And our potential enemies know it. But they realize that once they're in contact, they're only going to be in contact for a couple of days before they either open fire or again the guy goes back to port and they don't have to really follow him anymore. Where the stalking business is most difficult, most problematic, is when your SSBNs are being stalked, and this is one reason China isn't breaking the budget and expending a lot of resources on perfecting their SSBN. They apparently have a workable sea-launched ballistic missile after many failures. The Russians have a sort of successful. It's got a high failure rate, but high enough success rate to be, put a dozen of them in these new Bore SSBNs, and you've got a deterrent. But again, their problem is not how reliable their SSBNs are and how effective their SLBMs are, but how long will your boats last if they're being stalked by the Americans? That's their problem, not ours. We're constantly, that's one reason why we're in such a hurry to build a new class, the Columbia class of SSBNs. The Columbias are becoming obsolete. They're wearing out. But one of the big things that going into the Columbia is they're basically just a scaled up, somewhat larger version of the Ohio's. I'm sorry, the Ohio class. Is they want to put more silencing in, and you can only get a lot more silencing in if you design it and build it from scratch. You can make modifications, but it only works up to a point. So it's really a noise war out there, noise and experience. And so far, we have an edge in both areas, but that's prone to disappear because the Chinese are making a huge effort to close the qualitative gap. They can pretend that they've closed it more than they actually have, but that's how they operate. The last thing the Chinese want is a naval war. For the Chinese, a naval war would become a disaster from day one because they are not only confronted with the American Navy or the portion of the Pacific Fleet that's dedicated to China, and that's most of the Pacific Fleet, but also the South Korean and the Japanese navies. Between those three navies, the American faction of the fleet, our fleet, and all of the Japanese and South Korean fleet, they basically have more ships and better ships because the Japanese and the South Koreans have been putting their ships out to sea for long periods of time. Even though Japan has a latent military recruiting shortage because they're running out of people. They're not reproducing, but that's another story. They're still able to man the ships. Of course, that's one reason why they can't expand their Navy a lot. So they basically, if we're going to only have a few ships, let's make sure they're quality ships. South Koreans are doing the same thing. But that puts the Chinese at a disadvantage. But see, the Chinese think in the long term. They don't think about what if we go to war, tomorrow. No, what if we go to war in the 2030s or 2040s? And that's where you got to worry. Because when they started their run for a modern, efficient Navy, we're talking late 1990s. And at that point, everybody said, oh, come on, you're so far behind us. But, if you measure things in decades, they weren't so far behind at all. And now they're a lot closer than they were 20 years ago.
So, Al, tell us a little bit about the troubles that countries are having with their aircraft carriers.
There are sort of three types of aircraft carriers. There are the U.S.-type carriers, fairly large, and to be somewhat generous, you can certainly include the Brit and the French carriers, although they're about 60% the size of a U.S. carrier and have some different design features and whatnot. Then you have the sort of combined helicopter carriers that Italy, Japan, Korea are building or have built, which can operate fixed wing airplanes because of the aircraft, because of the ski jump, but are better suited to helicopters and vertical takeoff, which is kind of neat stuff, but it's very expensive and imposes some design restrictions on your ship that could be restrictive, could make it difficult to build ships in numbers. All that heat coming down on the deck as the plane lands requires special construction. And then, of course, the U.S. has a flock, and several other countries have a flock of just plain helicopter carriers, primarily for amphibious, we don't use the word, but trifibious operations, landing troops from the sea, through the air. Most countries that build them seem to be happy with them. China is working off a Russian design, so we're talking about a 40-year-old ship at this point. I think 40 years. God, it's a long time. And slowly building new ones. They're not building nuclear yet, which may be a design problem or maybe a cost-saving measure. It depends on what they want to do with them. Assuming China has ambitions, obviously they have ambitions in the South China Sea, and what do they call it, the island barriers? Mm-hmm. They want Taiwan. Do they want to go beyond that? If they want to go beyond that, the carriers they're building are probably not good enough. On the other hand, they can build a lot of them. It takes us 7 years to build a carrier that is unquestionably better than anything they've got, but they can build 3 or 4 of them in that time without any trouble. And learning how to use carriers, of course, even with the knowledge that you can sort of borrow from the other countries that have much greater experience with carriers. You have to be able to operate the damn things for a long period, and have the combat experience that gives you all sorts of little tricks that I'm sure there are plenty that we never hear about. One of the things I think that's interesting is that Italy and Japan are not supposed to have aircraft carriers on the basis of the treaties at the end of World War II. Now, they got away with them by calling them other things and by operating helicopters. But now that they're operating fixed-wing airplanes, the treaties that ended World War II are now 70 years in the past, so maybe people will just, politely forget about that. But I could see someone trying to make a fuss over it at some point. The French are now sending their carrier, I think, into the Indian Ocean, which should be quite interesting. The British presumably will be sending one of their carriers. They're still working up, and that takes a while. As far as we're concerned, the Ford suffers from the same problem that most of the rest of our ships suffer from, and that is that we piled so much new ideas into it, it may or may not be very effective. It's I forget how many years behind schedule to begin with, and it's not
4 now. 4 and counting.
Yeah, and it's still not it's been commissioned, but it's still not worked up, obviously. So I'm sort of in favor of going the British route Somewhat smaller ships, you can have a few more, which is probably helpful. When don't try to be a jack of all trades. Just specialize them to some extent. The other problem we have with them is the Air Force still doesn't like aircraft carriers, and which is interesting because, of course, on one level it's true. I mean, if you have air bases and whatnot, you're probably going to be able to do a better job than a couple of aircraft carriers are going to do. But it's awful hard to get an air base where you need it. And the example of the Korean War, or when we went into Afghanistan in 2001. I mean, most of the sorties were from carriers. I mean, the Air Force flew some F-15s to one of the Arab states, and then from there were running some missions. But most of the missions were being done from carriers, and you won't find that credited very much in Air Force literature. So we do need a better integration of our carriers into the national air power picture, I think, which would probably ease some of the problems carriers have, although it won't ease the design problems for a while. It's sort of like making a Lamborghini that can also, drive in jungles and deserts and New York traffic and stuff like that. And we have to decide what we want to do. Do we want more Lamborghinis or do we want more ATVs? And of course, we have a sole source problem. Every U.S. carrier is built by one company. And it is the only place that can build carriers anymore, since the Navy Yards, although they still have the few remaining Navy Yards, I should say, still have the graving docks where you could build a ship. They don't have any facilities to build ships. One of the good things about a dry dock is, of course, it never gets old. You can. One of the docks at Hoboken, when the QE2, no, it wasn't the QE2, it was one of the other more modern liners, had some problems a number of years ago. They took it into a dock that hadn't been used in like 30 years. But you just turn the taps and it works. I think the biggest problem with carriers is, if we have a full-up war, we cannot replace losses in any kind of, short time. And we can't even repair a major carrier in any kind of short time. So what the Chinese, with their smaller vessels and their larger resources in construction, have a huge edge. In the Second World War, something that is generally ignored, it wasn't so much the sinking of cargo ships that was a threat to the supply line to Britain, as it was the shortage of facilities to repair ships. So eventually we reached a point where we were building ships so fast we didn't bother repairing them anymore. But for a while, the real bottleneck was you couldn't repair ships fast enough to get them back to sea. And that's our problem. I think that we have to think about that in terms of a potential war at sea in the future. I think, does that answer your question?
Yep. So, Jim, let's focus on Russia for the last part of our discussion. What has happened with their shipbuilding capabilities, and are they even producing any new warships?
Well, the basic problem is when the Cold War ended in 1991 and Russia lost half its population and a lot of its territory, they also freed the serfs. I mean, as I tell people, who look at me incredulously, one thing the communists did was they reintroduced serfdom. Serfdom meaning you couldn't move, the state controlled where you worked and what you did. It was basically serfdom all over again. But when 1991 came, one thing the Russian people insisted on was no more restrictions on where we can work or immigration and what have you. And promptly, a lot of the more competent people left because the Russian economy was a mess because it was still based upon the command economy the communists had used to run their Russian economy into the ground. And one of the last places any competent engineer wanted to work was in a military plant, especially a naval yard. And the Russian Navy yards were not paragons of efficiency even during the Cold War when they got a lot of money. Russia never really had a major shipbuilding industry like the other contenders, as it were. During World War II, and for some years thereafter, the United States was the largest shipbuilder in the world, period. Merchant ships, that's what won World War II. We were turning out most of the ships, both, the victory ships and the other, the cargo ships. As Al pointed out, we turned out so many of them. If anyone got into had problems and needed some shipyard repairs, there was a long line. So you basically wrote that ship off. It was easier to build a new one. In one case, they built a victory ship in 24 hours, just to show how what they could do. But nowadays the situation is reversed. China is the only country, both China and South Korea and Japan are the only countries that can rapidly build a warship. They have the manpower, they have the yards, and like China, all three of those countries are dependent upon Australia for raw materials. You want coking coal, you want iron ore, you got to go to Australia. And they're the major producer in that part of the world. Otherwise, you might be able to go to the Americas, but that is an uncertain source since they're so far away. So the Chinese have problems that the United States did not have during World War II. So there's never going to be another World War II again. Basically, you're going to go to war with the Navy you have, and the only replacements are going to be much cheaper. Now, one thing we're doing, I don't know if we're doing this consciously, but we have energetically gone into the process of equipping the amphibious ships, which we have over 20. I think it's close to 30 now, to operate F-35Bs. These are the vertical takeoff. Well, actually, they're SOVOL. They can take off from a deck over a ski jump deck, or even a catapult, carrying more weight, as it were, or they can take off vertically, but, with a much reduced war load, of bombs and missiles. But given the fact that everything we use now in terms of dropping from planes is guided, that's much less of a restriction than it was in the past. But our allies are doing the same thing. South Korea, Japan, and some European countries, are also looking around doing the same thing. Now, they don't have as many of these amphibious warships as we have. In fact, Turkey, which is receiving its first LHD, I believe. It was, I think, the Spanish built it. Lavatinia, that's Spanish, right? 27,000 tons. But even before they how should I put it? Even before they got thrown out of the F-35 program in 2019, the first one's supposed to be by mid-year to this year. It's supposed to enter service, and they're thinking about ordering another one. They realized, oh my God, we lost our F-35B. Now, they hadn't ordered any F-35Bs, but as long as they were in the F-35 program, they had the option to. And they were seriously considered up until 2019. So what have the, innovation is often born out of desperation. So what the Turks are going to do now is they have a new UFV that was already in the works. This is the Bakhtiar. The TB2, they deployed hundreds of these in Syria, Libya, Armenia, and various other theaters, and they've all performed very successfully, even though this model only has a payload of 150 kilograms. But they can devote about two-thirds of that to missiles, and they have produced at least 4 different laser-guided missiles, which weigh less than half of what the Hellfire weighs. So they were just lucky. But what they're doing now is they're planning on modifying their first LHD, which has a ski jump. They kept that in. That was a feature of the Navitidia because they operated Harriers and various other aircraft off these ones, but they have to modify it to be able to launch the larger, about 1 ton, Bakhtiar 3, which was already in the works. And also modify it. They have to navalize it, folding wings, a tail hook and what have you. They don't have to worry about losing pilots in getting the landing and takeoff software, especially the landing software, to work because they're unmanned. But they're very cocky right now, and they haven't got much choice because their idea of having a amphibious ship / light aircraft carrier is gone, and they have to improvise, and they'll probably be successful because they're eager, they're desperate, and they have no choice. It's something the U.S. Navy has considered, but the Navy was never as desperate as the Turks are. And some of our allies who can get the F-35B, they're content to go with that because that is a superior, aircraft to operate off these well, we used to call them jeep carriers in World War II, but these amphibious ships. But I think the Navy experimented with taking one of their larger amphibious ships and shipping out 16 F-16Bs. That's about the maximum capacity. One advantage the Turks have in their LHD, as ordered, it was built to have a movable, a large movable, bulkhead between the hangar deck, which was only about 3,000 square feet or whatever it was. It was 9,900 cubic meters. I forget the translation for that. But anyway, but there was a vehicle deck which was next to the well deck where they had some amphibious craft to take off tanks, other armored vehicles, trucks, what have you. They can quickly, modify this, open up that large door between the two spaces, and triple the space of their carrier. And they realized that they could put at least a dozen F-35Bs on there. But if they can get their navalized new UFV, which has a larger capacity and a longer range, et cetera, they could put over 30 of them on this 27,000-ton amphibious ship. They have no choice if they want to embark, fixed-wing warplanes on their new carrier without access to the F-35B. I mean, there is no other competition. During the Cold War, you had the Harrier, which actually went through 3 generations. We talk about 2, the Carrier 1 and the Harrier 2. But these were much less efficient and effective as the B-35B. In fact, much of what made the B-35B a success was learning from all the problems they had with even the improved Harrier. The Russians had a well, they had something like 39, mid-39, or whatever it was, which was really, it was so bad that as soon as the Cold War ended, that got added to the growing junk pile of ships and aircraft that were no longer needed. It never really worked. In fact, the Russians are taking great, how should I put it, pride in the fact that the Chinese are having such big problems with their carrier jet, the J-15, which is basically a copy of the Su-33, which was a variant of the Su-27, which is basically their F-15, that was navalized to replace the MiG-29, which never worked very well. And the Su-33 didn't work very well, but it worked better than MiG-29. But the Chinese, when they copied the Su-33, I think they bought 1 or 2 of them, early models, they have not been able to work all the kinks out. And that's one limitation on their carrier construction, aside from the government not willing to throw a lot of money at carriers that they won't need for a while, a couple of decades, when they don't really have a reliable fixed wing jet to operate from it. So what the big game changer in carrier warfare, in the last 10 years is the realization that F-35, stealth, vertical takeoff stealth fighter is a game changer for a lot of countries who want effective naval aviation. Because if you have a couple of amphibious ships, and some countries are buying amphibious ships just for that option, buying some F-35Bs, sticking them on there, and having a real threat. And this is the thing that a lot of critics of the Navy have put forward, more small carriers. Well, there's all sorts of arguments for and against that, but basically they're not as effective. But it depends on what kind of war you're fighting for. And this is something the Air Force would never admit, as Al points out. After World War II, sure, we had more and more naval bases all over the world, but they were sitting targets, literally. And the Navy could move their airfields, which are much more difficult targets to hit. Not as difficult now with the Chinese and the Russians developing weapons, which they impolitely call carrier killers. But the Navy still has these mobile airfields, which in a pinch, which has been the normal condition since World War II, there's always been an emergency, and the Air Force says, well, give us about 6, 8, 12, 20 months, and we'll have big capacity there, whereas the Navy was already there. As Al points out, the Navy the Air Force doesn't like to dwell on that, but it's still the situation. The Air Force practices, a rapid deployment to a how should I put it, an unprepared airfield. They have special task forces to do this, but they don't have that many of them, and they really can't put that many aircraft into these out-of-the-way areas, and they aren't really equipped. You need supplies, you need repair facilities, and so the Air Force is learning the hard way that there's no way they can replace the capability of aircraft carriers. And a lot of other countries are realizing that too, and of course they're also cognizant of the fact that you don't need a lot of carrier aircraft carrying a lot of bombs, because mostly everybody is using, guided bombs and guided missiles. So you need a fraction of the number of bombs and missiles that a World War II or a pre-1990s, a pre-GPS and laser-guided, missile era required. And suddenly a lot of countries are realizing that, hey, we can have that. And that's why the Japanese are building all these helicopter destroyers, which I think some of them are even being named after World War II carriers, one of them at least. But the Japanese aren't getting any pushback, because we've been on their case for years to, hey, change your constitution or build in an escape clause, which they did, and start building this stuff. And of course the Japanese also realize that, hey, now they can export this stuff for defensive purposes only. And they're doing that, and they're competing for export sales, because they are still a premier shipbuilding and naval shipbuilding power, which we aren't, and it's all for the same reasons. We haven't got the yards, we haven't got the manpower base, the skills base, and that, as Japan found out in World War II, they painfully, at great expense considering their GDP, before World War II, they built up this huge fleet, but they couldn't replace it, and we have replaced them.
Well, that's a good place for us to end. We're out of time, and we'll talk to you gentlemen next time we meet. Bye.
Indeed.